Well, of course, it's not quite as simple as that. The objection to the liberal democratic view is not so much the value of peaceful negotiation, but the final solution at the end of such, which is a majority democratic, as it's understood, vote. You've all had your say, and we're now going to vote. And if the secular are in the majority, then the secular agree to this. Democracy is the way to go. If the religious are in the majority, they agree to it too. This is the way to go. And we see this in churches. If the church was fundamentalist, then it doesn't mind democracy, the diaconate vote or the membership vote, and they're all fundies and they all agree. Except for the new liberals. And they, of course, have to split off and set up supposedly a daughter church down the road, which is really a splinter group, of course. They never talk to the parent body again. And if, on the other hand, you get a sort of takeover in a fundy church where it's now becoming a majority of liberals, if you like, what they mean in a not necessarily believing in a certain dogmatic interpretation of, they've got a different dogmatic interpretation, perhaps. Then, of course, it's the fundies that have to split off and move down the road. And they do. Another daughter church, similarly not talking to the supposed parent church, which is now very liberal Christian. Or very charismatic Christian. Instead of the charismatic splitting off, it's the fundies that had to split off. In other words, the objection is not so much to the harmony of everyone giving their democratic say and influencing the decision. It's how the final decision is made, which is by majority. And that doesn't presuppose a safety mechanism in a world in which we're influenced and led by those that have the most influence and leading, whether they're right or wrong. And that is what determines the result of the election, the voting. Not some safety principle of each individual being wise or of varying degrees in their own right. Of course, some people will see the very act of negotiation with manipulating opposition as dangerous. Especially religious people vis-a-vis non-religious. And therefore they won't do it. And liberal people are in a sense the same. They're liberal with liberals. And they're in agreement to keep out, in fact, dogmatism, which is what the illiberals are. At least from their point of view. They therefore declare the negotiating agenda to exclude dogmatism, instead elevating the democratic process of voting, the majority. But of course you can find in this milieu of political climate that those who have the power manage to get decisions through contra to the will of the majority. And your voting system doesn't seem to be proof against such power brokers. So we end up with a superficial politics, not actually being applied to fundamental changes that power brokers want. The superficial issues, politics rather, are never agreed on, only determined by the voting process at one level or another, whilst fundamentals are being determined outside that arena. In other words, the politics is just a distraction process. And this has become the art of how to steer a democratic society, how to use democracy in the interest of power brokers. I mean, they're not just the international business tycoons. They're other wealth holders and other power holders, prestige, individuals, those that influence effectively the various focuses of power in a society. We like to trust that this focus of power is not focused, but is some squabbling hierarchy, and that on average good comes of it. If in some subtle way it becomes unified or concentrated, then that could be a major threat to the population at large, who are still fussing over their politics, their principles, and possibly what they're fed by their media, which may well be that everything's fine really, other than these surface issues that are on the political agenda and are being sorted. Oh, you've wandered into cynicism, Marshall, and the conspiracy theory agenda. Well, it's like the black market. I mean, you don't know how important it is, do you, in the economy? Because you can't measure it. You don't know. You can have wishful thinking like we have ascribed to the religious sector. Everything's starry wonderful, really, in the society. We're a wonderful democratic society. There's no problem. Or you can be like the secular, concerned that things are getting worse, despite the presence of this democratic God that they seem to have. Can you rely on the deceived decision-making of the majority? Is the concept of democracy always safe? We usually come down on, well, it's safer than the alternative. Look at the way they're pressing into Europe and America and Australasia, fleeing from these other countries. Well, as you know, I step away from the whole issue. I say, well, that's not the point. This world is a mix of good and bad, so that we learn from such. And it's teaching us as individuals very well. As we mature through life, there's a great tendency to become clearer on what we think is good and what we think is evil. Does that mean decision-making would be more reliably made by mature elders like myself, of course? Said he, totally objectively. Oh, goodness, no. I've met so many of my generation that I don't agree with. That's the last thing I want. I find far more idealism in youth than I do in age. Far more variability as well, of course. At one stage in history, we used to think that the better educated should have more votes than the ignorant. In churches, we tend to think that those that have been there longest should have more votes than others. They become deacons, and deacons make decisions without democratically testing every decision with the church. Well, they test it and then they do what they think is right anyway. And nowadays that often means getting shot at the present minister. It's not very Christian, I can tell you. Perhaps it is. Perhaps it was always like that. So in some ways I find myself cynical as regards the world, because I take it to be a mix of good and evil, and idealistic about the existence of God, because my experience of trusting in such leads me to think this is the way to go. I feel I cope with life far better than when I didn't, and I'm much happier, can cope with the difficulties and have far more joy and happiness. Thank you, Heavenly Dad.